It's over, Evelyn, Caspian sneered, tightening his grip on my mother's waist. Harlan is Ash, and this estate is mine. You're just a guest in a house that no longer remembers your name. My mother wouldn't even meet my eyes. Please, honey, just sign the papers. Caspian is our future now. I felt the diary's leather cover pressing against my ribs, a silent indictment of their murder plot. He didn't die in an accident, Mom, I whispered. And he didn't leave me his money. He left me his truth. I swallowed the bitter taste of their betrayal, smoothing my dress as I prepared to walk into the lion's den one last time. I exhaled, turning the brass handle and stepping away from the cold shadows of the hallway into the suffocating glow of the gala. The air inside the hollows was thick, heavy with the cloying, sweet scent of lilies and the metallic tang of expensive champagne. It was a smell that tried too hard to hide the rot beneath the floorboards. I stood near the marble columns of the grand ballroom, my spine a rigid line of military precision I had never quite managed to unlearn. Around me, the elite of Savannah drifted like ghosts in silk and tuxedos, their laughter sounding like the hollow clinking of crystal against stone. They were celebrating 1 year of bliss between my mother and the man who had stepped into my father's shoes before the polish on them had even dulled. I watched the light from the massive chandeliers shatter against the glassware, thinking about how easy it is to mistake a polished surface for depth. My father, Harlan, used to say that grace isn't the absence of a struggle, but the presence of composure during it. I felt that struggle now, a slow, grinding pressure behind my ribs. As an archival specialist, my entire life was dedicated to the preservation of truth, to the meticulous restoration of history. Yet here I was, standing in the home my father built, watching his history being systematically erased. I looked at my hands, resting loosely at my sides. They were steady, though my heart was hammering a rhythm of silent rebellion. I wasn't just a guest at this party. I was a ghost haunting my own life. Evelyn, for heaven's sake, move away from the wall! You look like a gargoyle! My mother, Marlowe, swept toward me, her silk gown hissing against the floor like a warning. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my hair, my posture, the slight smudge on my shoe. To her, I wasn't a daughter who had just returned from months of grueling work. I was a blemish on the curated perfection of her new life. She had traded her piano sonatas for the hollow applause of Caspian's social circle, and she wanted me to play the part of the grateful, silent background character. I'm just observing, Mom, I said, my voice low and level. It's a beautiful party. It's an important party, she corrected, her eyes darting toward the center of the room where Caspian stood. Caspian has invited the board of the Historical Society. They need to see us as a united front. Try to look less archival. We don't see things as they are, Evelyn. We see them as we are. And right now, you look like you're judging everyone. She didn't wait for an answer. She never did. She turned back to the crowd, her smile clicking into place like a well-oiled machine. I realized then that she was blinded by the very light she had helped create. She couldn't see the shadows stretching out from Caspian's feet, or perhaps she just refused to look. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you started to doubt your own eyes? It's a terrifying kind of fog. The music shifted, a sharp violin crescendo that felt like a needle under the skin. Caspian broke away from a group of men, estate lawyers and local developers, the kind of men who smelled of leather and litigation. He didn't just walk. He claimed the space he moved through. When he reached me, he didn't offer a greeting. He offered an order. The catering staff is short-handed in the East Wing, Caspian said, his voice a smooth, calculated baritone that never quite reached his eyes. He reached out and took a tray of champagne from a passing waiter, then thrust it toward my chest. Help them out. Serve the gentlemen by the fireplace. They were associates of your father's. I'm sure they'd love to see Harlan's daughter making herself useful. It was a public execution of my dignity. He wasn't ignoring me. He was categorizing me. In this house, those who don't contribute to the future must serve those who do. By handing me that tray, he was telling the room, and me, that I was a guest by courtesy only. He knew the legal ambiguity of the Harlan Trust was still being debated in dark offices, and he was using that uncertainty as a leash. I looked at the tray, then up at his arrogant smirk. My knuckles whitened, but I didn't pull away. I remembered a fundamental truth. Kindness is a choice that requires more strength than anger ever could. If he wanted a servant, I would show him a masterclass in poise. I took the tray. "Of course, Caspian," I replied, my voice as cold and clear as the gin in the glasses. "Service is a lost art. I'd hate for your guests to go thirsty while you're so busy managing things." I moved through the crowd with the steady hand of a woman who had handled ancient, crumbling scrolls. I didn't feel small. I felt invisible. And invisibility is a type of power. As I served the men who had once tried to squeeze my father out of his own firm, I listened. I heard the whispered mentions of liquidating assets and streamlining the trust. Caspian was pressuring Marlowe to sign documents that would effectively hand him the keys to everything Harlan had built. It was a predatory takeover disguised as family administration. "Evelyn, a word. Now!" Marlowe had intercepted me near the hallway. Her face was flushed, her hand gripping my upper arm with surprising force. She pulled me into the shadows of the corridor, away from the prying eyes of the Savannah gentry. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her eyes fixed on my neck. "I told you to be reasonable. That necklace, take it off. It's clunky, it's old-fashioned, and it clashes with the diamonds Caspian gave me to give to you. It looks like you're clinging to the past." My hand went instinctively to the heavy gold locket Harlan had given me on my 21st birthday. It was the only thing I had left that felt real. "A diamond is just a piece of charcoal that handled stress exceptionally well, Mom," I said, my voice trembling only slightly. "I'll keep my father's gift. It doesn't clash with anything that actually matters." The betrayal in her eyes was sharp, but it was muffled by the sedatives Caspian had been suggesting she take for her nerves. She looked at me as if I were a stranger, a ghost trying to ruin her feast. She didn't apologize for the tray in my hand, or the man who had put it there. She just turned away, leaving me standing in the dark. I watched her walk back into the light, back to the man who was slowly erasing her. Caspian watched me from across the ballroom, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He thought he had broken me. He thought that by making me serve his guests and endure his insults, he had won. He had no idea that I had spent the entire night documenting every interaction, every suspicious legal term, and every person who looked too closely at the safe in the study. The party finally began to wind down, the laughter turning brittle as the guests retreated to their cars. I didn't wait to say goodbye. I retreated to the back stairs, my feet knowing the way by heart. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing the worn, cool leather of my father's diary. I had found it tucked away, a silent witness to a life cut short. I slipped into my room and locked the door, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. I sat on the edge of the bed and touched the cover of the book. The truth doesn't scream, it waits. It waits for someone with the patience to listen and the courage to act. I thought I was alone in my mourning, but as I opened the first page and saw my father's meticulous handwriting, I realized he was still talking to me. The ink was faint, but the message was clear. I wasn't just his daughter. I was his last line of defense. The weight of the diary in my hands felt like an anchor, grounding me as the artificial laughter of the party downstairs finally faded into the heavy, humid silence of a Savannah night. I retreated to the only place in the hollows that still held the scent of truth, my father's old attic studio. Climbing those stairs felt like ascending into a different world. The air here was thick with dust and the comforting, earthy smell of aged cedar, a sharp contrast to the suffocating floral perfumes Marlowe and Caspian had draped over the rest of the house. I ran my fingertips across Harlan's old oak drafting table. The wood was scarred with the marks of 1,000 ink pens, and the precision of a man who believed that if the foundation wasn't solid, the whole structure was a lie. As an archival specialist, I knew that buildings were rarely just wood and stone. They were maps of the souls who built them. "A house is a machine for living," Le Corbusier once said, but I knew better. A home is a vessel for secrets, and my father was the master architect of this one. I refused to let Caspian's petty insults linger in my mind like smoke. He had tried to make me feel small by handing me that tray, but self-possession is the only true power anyone ever truly owns. I wasn't hiding in this attic. I was repositioning my pieces on a board he didn't even know existed. In the corner, tucked behind a stack of weathered blueprints, I found a small, hand-carved wooden bird. My father had made it for me when I was 6 years old. I remembered the way his rough, calloused hands had smoothed the wings, his quiet patience a stark opposite to the loud, destructive entitlement Caspian wore like a suit. Harlan preferred the quiet construction of a life over the ego of the spotlight. It was a moment of profound longing that caught in my throat, a reminder of the man I was fighting for. My mind drifted back to the sterile white walls of the hospital, 48 hours after the accident that shattered our world. The hum of the ventilators provided a rhythmic, mechanical pulse for a life that was slipping through my fingers. Harlan couldn't speak. The tubes and the trauma had stolen his voice, but his eyes were alive, burning with a frantic, desperate warning. He didn't look at Marlo when she entered the room. He didn't even look at Caspian, who stood in the corner like a vulture waiting for the wind to change. Instead, he pulled me close, his grip surprisingly firm for a man so broken. He reached for my right hand and used his thumb to trace a specific geometric symbol into the center of my palm. It was a square within a circle, bisected by a single vertical line, the secret door icon he used in his private architectural sketches. He didn't point. He didn't whisper. He stayed silent, not out of fear for his own life, but out of a desperate need to protect mine. If he had spoken, if he had accused Caspian then, I would have been the next accident. I saw the sacrifice in his gaze and understood that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't the truth you scream, but the words you choose to bury for someone else's safety. Back in the present, I knelt in the center of the attic floor. I pushed aside the heavy Persian rug, my heart echoing the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. There, carved into the floorboard beneath his desk, was the same symbol. It was a testament to his foresight, a breadcrumb left in the dark for the only person he knew would look for it. I pried the panel loose. Inside sat the leather-bound diary, cool to the touch and smelling of old parchment and a life well lived. This was my North Star in the coming storm. I held the book to my chest for a moment. My intention wasn't to hurt Marlo, despite how easily she had let Caspian replace the memory of my father. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing the behavior. It means not letting that behavior dictate the rest of your story. I wasn't looking for vengeance. I was looking for the justice Harlan had meticulously documented. I opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Disciplined, elegant, and chillingly precise. It wasn't just a diary. It was a log of the quiet encroachment of a predator. He had noted every time Caspian stumbled into private conversations, every time legal loopholes were discussed like they were open doors, and every time the brakes on the car felt slightly off during routine maintenance. I flipped toward the end, the pages turning with a dry, rasping sound in the silence. My breath hitched when I reached the entries from late 2024. The dates were listed in a neat column, matching the weeks leading up to the crash. Beside the final 3 dates, Harlan had written a single word in red ink, underlined twice. Brakes! The red ink seemed to tremble under my flashlight. A silent scream recorded on the paper, confirming that the sleeping figure on my father's bed was not merely a money-hungry person, but a murderer. I closed the diary, the weight of the secret pressing down on my palm. The air in the attic was now colder, as if the truth had finally been unleashed from its cage. The attic had become a sanctuary of cold, clinical reality. I didn't let the horror of that single word, brakes, paralyze me. Instead, I moved with the practiced, detached efficiency of my profession. I retrieved my archival kit, the ultraviolet light, and the chemical reagents I usually used to restore 19th century property deeds. In the early hours of February 2nd, while the rest of the mansion slept in a shroud of expensive lies, I began to peel back the layers of the diary. Under the narrow beam of the UV light, the blank spaces between my father's neat lines began to shimmer. Hidden text emerged in a ghostly, fluorescent glow. It was like watching a man speak from beyond the veil. Harlan had been a meticulous record keeper. He knew that in a world of predators, the only defense is a paper trail that cannot be disputed. My father's hidden script was a physical indictment, a map of his own murder. He had documented a minor fall he suffered 6 months before the crash. The hidden text described Caspian standing over him on the marble floor of the study, a small, triumphant smile on his lips while he held Harlan's heart medication just out of reach. My breath hitched as a grainy, tucked-away Polaroid fell from the back lining of the book. It was a shot Harlan had taken from a hidden security camera in the garage, showing Caspian's silhouette crouching by the undercarriage of the Mercedes, his hands gloved and busy. Justice is not about the speed of the strike, but the weight of the evidence. I understood now that my father didn't just want me to be angry, he wanted me to be undeniable. Integrity is doing the right thing, even when the truth is a burden that feels like lead in your stomach. I began digitizing every page, every photo, uploading them to a secure, encrypted server. Each click of the camera was a nail in the coffin of Caspian's freedom. As the sun began to bleed through the attic window, the mission shifted from the past to the present. The diary mentioned a daily supplement that Caspian insistently prepared for my mother, Marlo. He called it a wellness routine to help her through her grief. I slipped down to the kitchen at 6 a.m., my footsteps silent on the hardwood. I found her pill organizer sitting on the granite countertop next to a half-empty bottle of expensive scotch. I took a blue capsule and opened it on a piece of wax paper. Using a handheld scanner and a pharmaceutical database, I looked up the symbols. My hands didn't tremble, but a cold, sharp fire flared up in my chest. It wasn't a vitamin. It was an illegal tranquilizer, a drug used to induce chronic confusion and short-term memory loss. Caspian wasn't just stealing money, he was actually erasing my mother's memory to ensure she wouldn't suspect anything about the legal documents he was forcing her to sign. Marlo entered the kitchen 10 minutes later. She looked frail, her eyes foggy and unfocused as she reached for the coffee I had prepared. She smiled at me, a weak, ghost-like expression. "Caspian is so wonderful, Evelyn," she whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves. "He takes such good care of me. He says I've been so forgetful lately, that I need these supplements to stay balanced." I had to bite my tongue so hard I tasted copper. I reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Despite the insults she had hurled at me during the party, despite her refusal to see the truth, I felt a wave of protective love so strong it nearly broke my stoic mask. "True care doesn't require a prescription for silence, Mom," I said softly. "It requires honesty." She didn't understand. She just nodded vaguely and took the placebo I had swapped into her organizer. I wasn't going to let her disappear into the fog he was creating. My resolve was no longer just about the house or the money. It was about saving the woman who had forgotten how to save herself. I retreated to my room to study the legal landscape. I searched the Georgia Slayer Statute, a powerful piece of legislation that prevents a murderer from inheriting any assets from their victim. The diary was no longer just a book of memories. It was a legal weapon. If I could prove the murder plot, every document Caspian had manipulated Marlo into signing would be voided. I reflected on the American principle that sunlight is the best disinfectant. I wouldn't attack Caspian in the shadows or through petty revenge. I would bring the full weight of the truth into the most public forum possible. I began drafting a timeline, cross-referencing Harlan's notes with Caspian's financial moves. An hour later, Caspian entered the study where I was working. He didn't knock. He stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room, his gaze lingering on my archival case. He was looking for signs of rebellion, for the dreamy youngest daughter to show a crack in her armor. I offered him a polite, steady smile. "Good morning, Caspian," I said, my tone as smooth as the marble in the foyer. "I was just organizing some of Dad's old letters. It's important to keep things in their proper place, don't you think?" He narrowed his eyes, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face before he masked it with a smirk. "Records are for the past, Evelyn. Some of us are focused on the future." "The future is built on the past," I replied, "and sometimes the past has a way of catching up." He left without another word, but the air he left behind felt tainted. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway before I went into their master suite. I knew he was arrogant, and arrogant men always keep trophies. I found it in the bottom of his nightstand, a heavy, nondescript envelope. Inside was a list of names, 5 women, all wealthy, all deceased. The first 3 had dates of death neatly written next to them in the same ink he used for his business ledger. My mother's name was at the bottom of the list. There was no date next to her name yet, only a question mark. My mother thought she was being loved into a new life, but I was looking at a list of women who had been loved into their graves. The names on that list weren't just strangers. They were a trail of broken lives that ended exactly where my mother's was headed. Looking at that question mark, I knew the clock wasn't just ticking. It was running out of time. The list of names felt like a physical weight in my pocket as I slipped out of the master suite. I could still see that chilling question mark next to Marlowe's name in my mind's eye. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. My father had been murdered for a trust fund, and now my mother was being groomed for the same fate. Her mind being slowly dissolved by the blue capsules I had swapped for placebos. I had to move faster, but in the world of high-stakes deception, speed is often the precursor to a fatal mistake. By the afternoon of February 3rd, Caspian began his next move, a cleansing ritual designed to sever the last emotional ties between Marlowe and the man she had actually loved. He stood in the grand hall, his voice a calculated blend of sympathy and authority as he spoke to my mother. He had convinced her that Harlan's old architectural sketches were traps for her grief, anchors that kept her sinking in the past. To ensure the cut was deep, he accused me of trying to sell those sketches to a rival firm behind her back. Marlowe looked at me with eyes that were glassy, a mixture of the lingering drugs and the masterful gaslighting Caspian practiced like an art form. She demanded that I prove my loyalty to our new family by burning the sketches in the grand fireplace. I stood there watching the man who had murdered my father hand my mother a long silver match. The heat from the hearth pressed against my face as I began to feed the sketches into the flames. I watched the charcoal lines Harlan had labored over, designs for libraries, homes, and parks, curl into black ash and vanish up the chimney. It was a scene of agonizing cruelty, a public execution of a legacy, but I didn't shed a single tear. I kept my face a mask of stoic compliance. A draft is just paper. The foundation of what my father taught me is stored in a place Caspian can never reach. I chose to play the role of the defeated daughter because in this game, the person who appears broken is the one they stop watching. I looked at Marlowe as the last of the vellum turned to smoke. I didn't feel anger toward her, only a profound, aching pity. Betrayal is always a reflection of the betrayer's heart, not the value of the one being betrayed. She wasn't herself. She was a casualty of a war she didn't even know she was fighting. Seeing her like this only made my mission more urgent. I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance anymore. I was fighting for her life. Retreating to the attic that evening, I dove back into the digital shadows. Using my professional credentials, I accessed federal archival databases and cross-referenced the names from Caspian's list with digitized newspaper morgues from across the southeast. The screens flickered in the dark room, illuminating my face with a cold blue light as headlines and grainy mugshots began to align in a horrifying pattern. Caspian didn't exist before 2020. He was a ghost, a master of reinvention who had operated under 3 different aliases: Arthur Vane in Tennessee, Julian Thorne in Virginia, and Silas Crane in Florida. In every single state, the story was identical. A wealthy, grieving widow, a whirlwind romance, and a sudden, accidental death shortly after the estate was transferred. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Caspian wasn't just a Hamtian gold digger. He was a predator who harvested lives. He was currently a fugitive wanted for questioning in a multi-state federal homicide investigation. This wasn't a local estate dispute. This was a federal case. I realized then that the Savannah police wouldn't be enough. If I tipped them off too early, Caspian's lawyers or his own survival instincts would help him slip through the cracks and vanish into a new identity. I needed the FBI to close the circle. The moral weight of what I was carrying felt like it was crushing the air out of my lungs. I watched Marlowe from the shadows of the hallway as she moved toward her bedroom, a woman literally fading away in her own home. The truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. You just have to let it loose at the right moment. I spent the next 4 hours organizing my digital files into a comprehensive dossier, cross-referencing Harlan's diary entries with the federal records I had uncovered. Just after midnight, I went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. Caspian was there, leaning against the marble island, illuminated only by the light of the open refrigerator. He offered me a glass, his tone dripping with mock concern that made my skin crawl. "You've been very quiet today, Evelyn," he said, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the fire he thought he had extinguished. "Burning those old papers. It's a fresh start for all of us. Don't you agree?" I took the glass from his hand, my fingers brushing his for a split second. I didn't flinch. I met his gaze with a terrifying calm, the kind of stillness that comes when you have nothing left to lose. The cost of awakening is often high, and I had already paid it. I looked at him and thought about the question mark next to my mother's name. "Have you ever realized that the person you were trying to protect was the very weapon being used to destroy you?" "I agree that the past is finally being accounted for, Caspian," I replied. "And I think you'll find that some foundations are built to withstand a fire." He narrowed his eyes, the charm slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the cold, calculating hunter beneath. He knew I was different now, but he was too arrogant to believe a youngest daughter could actually be a threat. I left him standing in the dark kitchen and returned to my room. The Harlan Trust signing was only 2 days away. I knew that once those papers were signed, my mother's usefulness to Caspian would end, and the accident would follow shortly after. I sat at my desk and sent a dead man's switch email to my contact at the National Archives. It contained the entire dossier, the diary scans, the pill scanner results, and the federal fugitive links. If anything happened to me in the next 48 hours, the truth would be automatically released to every major news outlet and federal agency in the country. I finally laid down to sleep, my body exhausted but my mind racing. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the driveway below. I stayed perfectly still, my military training kicking in. I slipped out of bed and crept to the window, staying behind the heavy velvet curtain. Below, in the moonlight, I saw a dark silhouette crouching by the rear wheel well of my car. The figure moved with practiced, efficient motions. After a moment, the shadow stood up, glanced toward the house, and vanished into the darkness of the oak trees. The silence of the night was broken by a cold, sharp realization. My father's warning about breaks wasn't just a record of the past anymore. It was my immediate future. Caspian wasn't just waiting for the papers to be signed. He was done playing games. I was no longer the one doing the hunting. I was the target. The cold morning air of February 5th bit through my jacket as I loaded the last of my gear into my SUV. Caspian had orchestrated this family reconciliation trip to a remote cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains with the precision of a military campaign. He had spent days whispering in Marlowe's ear, convincing her that a weekend in the wilderness was the only way to heal the rift he had carefully widened. I watched him help my mother into their car, his touch lingering just a second too long on her arm. A possessive, predatory gesture disguised as affection. As I pulled out of the driveway of the Hollows, following their taillights toward the Georgia-North Carolina border, the scratching sound from the night before echoed in my mind. We hit the winding Appalachian roads, the asphalt snaking through dense thickets of pine and skeletal winter oaks. On the first long, sweeping incline, I shifted my foot to the brake pedal. It didn't push back. It felt spongy, sinking toward the floorboards with a sickening lack of resistance. My pulse didn't skyrocket. It went cold. Character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you, but courage is how you face those who want to do everything to destroy you. I didn't panic because Harlan hadn't raised a victim. He had raised a survivor. I tested the pedal again. Nothing. Caspian hadn't just sabotaged the vehicle. He had timed the failure for the steep descents that lay ahead. The betrayal escalated in the digital world while I fought for physical control. Miles ahead, Caspian used Marlowe's phone to send a series of pre-scheduled forged emails to our family lawyers and the social elite of Savannah. I knew exactly what they said without reading them. Evelyn is admitting to a mental breakdown. Evelyn is confessing to stealing family funds. Evelyn is asking for privacy while she seeks treatment. He was burying my reputation before he buried my body. We reached the crest of the mountain pass. The road turned into a steep, narrow descent with a sheer 1,000-foot drop into the ravine on my right. I watched Caspian's car in front of me. He slowed down, forcing me to close the gap, his face visible in his side mirror. He wasn't looking at the road. He was watching me. A mask of cold, predatory satisfaction settled on his features. Then the road dropped away, and my brakes failed completely. The SUV began to gain momentum, the heavy frame groaning as gravity took hold. I didn't scream. I recalled every lesson my father taught me about mechanical emergency handling during our summer drives through these very mountains. I downshifted the gears manually, feeling the engine roar as the compression began to fight the descent. I used the emergency brake in short, sharp bursts, praying the cable wouldn't snap. Guardrails blurred into a silver streak. I saw the curve coming, a sharp hairpin turn that led directly into the abyss. Caspian's car had already rounded it, vanishing from sight. He expected me to follow the laws of physics and fly off the cliff. Instead, I aimed for a narrow embankment of young pines and thick mountain laurel. I gripped the wheel, tucked my chin, and steered into the green. The impact was a violent symphony of shattering glass and crushing metal. The world spun, a kaleidoscope of needles and dirt, before the SUV came to a jarring, tilted halt against a massive oak. Silence rushed in, deafening and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine and the distant, lonely call of a hawk. I sat there for a long moment, my chest heaving against the seatbelt. My hand reached for the dashboard, where my father's carved wooden bird had been thrown by the force. I gripped the small wooden figure, the smooth wings pressing into my palm. A father's love isn't a shield that prevents the storm. It's the anchor that keeps you from being swept away by it. I was alive, and for the first time in a year, I was invisible. Down the road, I heard the faint screech of tires. I peered through the cracked windshield. Caspian had stopped his car. He stepped out, looking back at the rising plume of smoke from my wreckage. He didn't rush toward the crash. He didn't call for help. He stood there for a minute, adjusted his coat, and got back into the car to drive my mother toward the cabin. He assumed the Evelyn problem had been solved by the mountain. I crawled out of the shattered side window, my clothes torn and my shoulder throbbing, but my mind was sharper than ever. I understood the tactical pivot immediately. My supposed death was my greatest weapon. If Caspian believed I was gone, he would stop looking over his shoulder. He would become careless. He would sign the documents and finally show his true face to Marlowe. Silence is sometimes the loudest sound in the world. Have you ever had to let people believe they won, just so you could prepare for the real victory? There is a strange, quiet power in being forgotten. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my hidden backup burner phone. I sent a single encrypted text to my federal contact. The ghost is active. Proceed with the harvest. I began my trek through the dense forest toward the nearest logging road, avoiding the main highway. I wasn't a victim of an accident. I was the inevitable consequence Caspian never saw coming. I had survived the abyss, and now I was bringing the darkness back to him. From the shadows of the tree line, I watched the distant glint of his car disappear into the mountain fog. I opened Harlan's diary to the very last page, my fingers smudging the paper with dirt and engine oil. I wrote 3 words that felt like a vow. The harvest begins. The transition from the freezing Appalachian forest back to the humid, moss-draped streets of Savannah felt like crossing between 2 different lives. I had spent 48 hours as a ghost, hitching rides and moving through the shadows, watching as the world prepared to bury me. Caspian had returned to the hollows, exuding the confidence of a conqueror. He had spun a masterful tale for Marlowe, framing my silence following the accident as a final act of cowardice and guilt. He told everyone I had fled after stealing from the family estate, a narrative he used to tighten his grip on my mother's fading mind. By the evening of February 7th, the stage was set for his final victory lap. Caspian had gathered a group of prestigious witnesses and a high-level notary public in the Grand Hall. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of lilies and high-stakes greed. He was minutes away from having Marlowe sign the final transfer documents, legal papers that would move the $45 million Harlan Trust into a private shell company he controlled. He played the role of the grieving, burdened husband perfectly, guiding my mother's trembling hand as if she were a fragile trophy. I stood in the darkness of the library, watching through the crack in the heavy oak doors. Caspian leaned over Marlowe, his voice a smooth, calculated purr. It is a heavy burden to manage a legacy when those who should have cherished it have abandoned it so heartlessly, he told the room. I saw the Savannah elite nodding in silent judgment, falling for the polished surface of his lie. My father once told me that the most dangerous lies are the ones people are desperate to believe. I felt the weight of the digital files on the drive in my hand, the weight of a truth about to break the surface. Just as the pen's nib touched the signature line, I reached for the smart home controls on my tablet. The grand chandeliers flickered, then dimmed to a low amber glow. The room went silent, the kind of heavy, expectant quiet that precedes a storm. I stepped out from the shadows, my silhouette framed by the cold moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was bruised, my clothes were travel-stained, but I was undeniably alive. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Caspian froze, his face draining of color as if he were seeing a phantom. He looked at me, then at the pen in his hand, the mask of the grieving gentleman beginning to crack at the edges. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I tapped the screen, activating the mansion's high-definition projection system. The massive white wall behind the notary became a screen, and the banquet of phantoms truly began. I didn't present a diary. I presented a 4K indictment. The screen flickered to life with a video feed from the black box Harlan had hidden in the garage, synced with the audio I had recorded on the mountain pass. The room watched in horrified silence as Caspian's face appeared, crouching by the undercarriage of the Mercedes, his gloved hands busy with the brake lines. Then the audio from the mountain played, Caspian's voice, clear and cold, laughing as he watched my car veer toward the embankment. "One more variable erased," he had said. The room erupted. Guests stood up, their faces twisted in shock and disgust. Caspian staggered back, his predatory eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that was no longer there. Truth is the only thing that doesn't require a memory. It just requires a witness. I looked at him with the cold weight of the law in my eyes and finally spoke. "I didn't come here for an apology, Caspian," I said, my voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling. "I came to return the silence my father was forced into, and I came to tell you that you've been fighting for a vault that was already empty," Caspian snapped. The charm was gone, replaced by a feral, pathetic desperation. He lunged for the documents on the table, screaming that the video was a deepfake, that he was the legal husband and Marlowe still had the right to sign. He tried to force the pen back into my mother's hand, but she pulled away. The fog finally lifting as she stared at the screen showing the man who had tried to kill her daughter. I produced a folder of my own, original, irrevocable trust documents I had pulled from the National Archives. "You spent a year poisoning my mother for a signature that is legally worthless in the United States," I told him. I explained the Slayer statute, how his crimes had already disqualified him from any inheritance, but the real blow was the structure of the trust itself. Harlan had been far smarter than Caspian ever gave him credit for. He had placed the entire estate into a generations-skipping trust a decade ago. It was a sovereign entity that bypassed Marlowe entirely and vested solely in me upon Harlan's death. Caspian had spent millions of his own embezzled funds to maintain this house and this lifestyle, thinking he was investing in a payout. In reality, he had been paying to keep a house that belonged to the daughter he tried to murder. Justice is a slow-moving river, but it eventually reaches every shore. Have you ever seen a man realize he traded his soul for a vault that was already empty? The look on Caspian's face was the purest form of satisfaction I have ever known. It wasn't about the money. It was about the absolute restoration of my father's foresight. The sirens began to wail in the driveway, blue and red lights flashing against the portraits of my ancestors. Caspian looked at the documents, then at the police officers entering the hall, and his knees finally gave out. He collapsed into a chair, his mask shattered, a small, broken man who had run out of moves. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that signaled the end of Caspian's reign. The room began to clear, the guests fleeing the scene of the scandal they had almost blessed with their presence. I stood in the center of the hall, my father's house finally silent again. But the hardest part was still to come, facing the mother who had helped him try to destroy me. The dust finally began to settle over the hollows, but it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a long overdue exhale. By the morning of February 8th, the Grand Hall was no longer a theater for Caspian's performances. Federal agents had led him away in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled and his dignity stripped bare. The legal machinery of Georgia had moved with a swift, cold precision once the evidence was presented. The Slayer statute stood as an impassable wall, ensuring that a murderer could never profit from the life he stole. Every document Marlowe had signed under the fog of his deception was rendered null and void, as if they had never existed. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the red and blue lights of the last police cruiser fade down the moss-draped driveway. The silence that followed was profound. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to cope with it. For the first time in years, the house felt empty of shadows. Yet the restoration of Harlan's name was a task that had only just begun. I watched the sunrise bleed over the Savannah River, thinking about how truth, much like the morning light, has a way of finding every corner if you wait long enough. Marlowe sat in the center of the hall, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. The tremors in her hands had stopped since I replaced the sedatives, but they were now replaced by the crushing weight of her own choices. She was surrounded by the opulence she had almost died for, a queen in a kingdom of ash. I didn't feel the urge to gloat. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I walked into the kitchen, prepared a simple cup of tea, and brought it to her. It was a small gesture of kindness, the only bridge I was willing to build. "I didn't want to see it, Evelyn," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking of the clock. "I was just so lonely after your father. Caspian made me feel like I mattered again." "I know, Mom," I said, my voice steady but soft. "But loneliness is a poor reason to let someone destroy your soul." She looked up at me, her eyes filling with a desperate hope that I would simply step in and fix her life, that I would stay and manage the estate while she retreated back into her music. She began to plead, using the familiar hooks of guilt and family duty, asking me to help her run the hollows. But I had reached my limit. I produced a single cream-colored envelope from my pocket and set it on the table between us. Inside was a one-way ticket to a quiet coastal town in Maine and a legal notice for a modest, fixed monthly allowance. I had protected the secret, and now I was protecting my peace. I explained the sovereign boundary I had established through the trust. Because of the generation-skipping clauses Harlan had meticulously drafted, Marlowe was legally barred from managing the Harlan Trust. I wasn't kicking her out of hatred, but I was setting a permanent boundary she could no longer cross. "You didn't lose your voice because of Caspian, Mom," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "You lost it the moment you stopped listening to your own heart. I can provide you with a home, but I cannot provide you with a conscience. You have to learn to live with the truth you tried to burn." It was a chilling but necessary separation. I was no longer the youngest daughter waiting for approval. I was a woman choosing her own survival. Marlowe stared at the ticket, the realization finally sinking in that the world she knew was gone, replaced by a reality she had to face alone. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I drove to Bonaventure Cemetery. The Spanish moss hung like gray lace from the ancient oaks, swaying in the salt breeze. I walked to Harlan's grave, the stone cool and solid under my hand. I placed the original, unburned sketches and the leather diary on the granite. The archival specialist had finally completed her most important assignment. The truth was preserved, and the records were closed. Strength isn't about how hard you hit. It's about how much you can take and keep moving forward. I stood there in the somber grace of the dusk, realizing I was no longer defined by the expectations of a toxic family or the shadow of a predator. I was the architect of my own future now. In the end, I didn't win out of revenge. I won by choosing a peace they couldn't touch. I turned and walked away from the grave as the Savannah sky turned a deep, bruised purple. I didn't look back at the mansion or the graveyard. The camera of my life was pulling back, showing the vast, enduring landscape of the South. a land that had seen 1,000 secrets and 1,000 sunrises. As I reached my car, my phone dinged. A notification from the National Archives appeared on the screen. A final file had been digitized from Harlan's private server, dated the morning of his accident. It was titled, "For Evelyn, When the Dust Settles." I thought the story ended with the arrest, but as I opened that final digital file, I realized my father had one last gift to give, a map to a future I never dared to imagine. The harvest was over, but the planting was just beginning.